India has set its sights on, well, an incredibly ambitious goal, becoming a developed economy by 2047.
Huge goal.
Yeah, it's a vision buzzing with potential, energy, sky-high expectations, really. But right in the middle of all that excitement, a key figure, someone right at the heart of India's economic strategy, is sounding, well, a pretty stark warning.
That's right. And this deep dive, it's all about unpacking that specific perspective. We're talking about India's chief economic advisor, V. Anantha Nageswaran.
Okay.
He gave this really significant address back on May 29th, 2025, at the CII Annual Business Summit. And look, he wasn't just, cheering from the sidelines. He actually pinpointed critical threats that he believes could absolutely derail this whole 2047 vision.
And that's exactly what we want to zero in on in this deep dive. We're going to look closely at those key threats he identified, particularly what he's calling a critical trust deficit, and also these unsustainable economic imbalances. The big question we're trying to answer, I suppose, is how these issues fundamentally risk trapping India, keeping it from escaping that dreaded middle-income trap.
Right. And crucially, he didn't just lay out the problems and leave it there. He offered a clear three-pronged strategy, a formula really that he thinks is absolutely essential to navigate these challenges.
Which is?
Trust, deregulate, and reciprocate.
Trust, deregulate, reciprocate. Okay, so get ready. We're going to unpack the three big challenges the CEA flagged, take a proper look at this pervasive trust issue he mentioned, and then connect the dots, show how his proposed strategy is actually designed to tackle them head on.
Sounds good. We'll be drawing directly from the insights he shared.
Let's dive in.
Okay, so at the heart of the CEA's message, you've got this dual concern. He totally acknowledges the 2047 ambition, of course, but he sees the path there as, well, highly precarious.
Precarious why, exactly?
Because of this critical trust deficit we mentioned and these unsustainable economic imbalances. These are the two big rocks in the road, as he sees it.
And he's clear these aren't just, academic discussion points, are they?
Not at all. He argues these are the very forces that could keep India stuck in that middle-income trap.
Which, just to clarify for you, the listener, that's when a country grows quite a bit, moves up from low income, but then just stalls out.
Yeah.
It can't quite make that final leap to becoming a truly high-income developed nation.
Exactly right. And he outlined three primary structural challenges that he believes are standing squarely in the way of India actually hitting that 2047 target.
All right, let's get into them. What's the first big hurdle he identified?
Okay, the first one. He calls it the mismatched inheritance.
Mismatched inheritance.
Yeah.
Intriguing.
Yeah, and the core idea here is pretty striking, actually. He argues India is effectively saddled, that's his word, with a development model that's fundamentally unsuited to its own reality.
Unsuited how? What kind of model are we talking about? Is it about industry versus services or?
It's more fundamental. It's about it being deeply capital intensive. And he traces its origins way back to the Western Industrial Revolution.
Okay. Which, if I remember my history, wasn't exactly driven by having loads of spare workers hanging around.
Precisely. The CEA actually called it a kind of historical accident. He argued it was driven primarily by the sheer lack of labor Europe faced after the Black Death.
Right. Huge population drop.
Exactly. So they had to invest heavily in machines, in capital, because human hands were just scarce and expensive.
So they built an economic engine designed for a situation where people were the scarce resource.
You got it. And his key point is that this model, born from labor scarcity, is fundamentally alien, again, his word to India's core strength.
Which is?
Its massive, young, labor-abundant population. So it creates what he calls an inherent handicap. You're trying to push growth mainly through capital investment in a country where your greatest untapped resource is actually people, is labor.
Wow. Okay, that framing is,
Yeah,
it's powerful. It really helps you understand why India might see, good headline GDP growth, but still struggle massively with creating enough jobs. Like trying to use a tool designed for the wrong job, applying a historical solution for labor scarcity to a modern labor surplus situation. And for you listening, understanding this mismatched inheritance is, I think, a really fundamental lens for looking at so many of India's economic puzzles today.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So moving to the second major challenge he highlighted, this one he calls the energy transition tightrope.
The energy transition tightrope. That definitely sounds like a tricky balancing act. What's the tension here?
The tension is hitting Viksit Bharat 2047. That's the developed India goal before you hit net zero 2070, the climate commitment.
Right. Two huge, potentially conflicting deadlines.
Exactly. And the difficulty is that the old model, the inherited capital-intensive one that powered Western growth, well, it relied massively on cheap, abundant energy, and overwhelmingly, that meant fossil fuels.
And shifting away from that, getting onto renewables, it's not just a simple swap, is it? It's not just plugging in solar panels instead of a coal plant.
Oh, not even close. It comes with huge costs.
Mm.
He mentioned often doubling investment costs because you need backup power for when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. Plus, you need massive upgrades to the electricity grid to handle it all.
Huge infrastructure costs,
Yeah,
then.
massive. He gave a sense of scale by pointing to China's grid plan. They're estimating something like $800 billion just for grid upgrades related to their transition.
Wow. $800 billion. That's a staggering amount of capital.
It really is. And on top of the cost, it introduces strategic vulnerabilities. Think about the critical minerals needed for batteries, for solar panels, for wind turbines.
Yeah, lithium, cobalt, rare earths.
Exactly. And often the sources for these are, as the CEA put it, strategically difficult, concentrated in places India might not have easy or reliable access to. So this whole energy transition, it's not just an environmental issue or a cost issue. It's a genuine strategic tightrope walk that directly impacts the pace of economic growth and its long-term sustainability.
Okay, that makes sense. So mismatched model, tricky energy transition. What's the third challenge? You mentioned the profit-job imbalance. This one feels, I don't know, maybe more immediate, perhaps even a bit controversial.
It is quite pointed, yeah. The CEA highlighted a trend in the Indian economy that he finds very concerning. Basically, corporate profitability. It's been surging, growing way faster, significantly faster than two other key things.
Okay, retire.
Capital formation, that's companies reinvesting profits back into their businesses, building factories, buying equipment, and worker compensation. Wages, salaries.
So profits are booming, but that money isn't flowing proportionally into either new investment or into workers' pockets.
That's the trend he's pointing to. Now, he did acknowledge there might have been reasons for this in the past.
Right. I think the original piece mentioned things like companies maybe needing to repair their balance sheets after some tough years, or maybe global economic growth was sluggish, and so they held back on investment.
He mentioned those factors, yes. But he was very direct in stating that whatever the historical context, the current situation is, quote, unsustainable.
Unsustainable. Strong word.
Very. And he didn't mince words. He had this really blunt quote that jumped out saying, this is something we cannot afford for the next 25 or 30 years.
Wow. Cannot afford.
Yeah.
That implies the stakes are incredibly high here. And that urgency, presumably, it's tied directly to India's massive need for job creation.
Absolutely, 100%. India needs to create something in the ballpark of 8 million non-farm jobs every single year.
Seek up.
Just to absorb the new people entering the workforce, let alone deal with existing underemployment. So if surging corporate profits aren't translating into more capital investment and more job creation and better wages, well, you've got a fundamental disconnect. It threatens social stability. It threatens broad-based prosperity.
Makes sense.
And he also tied this into the whole rise of AI and robotics. He stressed that how the economic gains from these new technologies get distributed, how much goes to the owners of capital, the machines, versus how much goes to labor, to workers. That's going to be absolutely crucial for income growth and savings patterns across the whole population going forward.
So, okay, we've got this inherited model that doesn't quite fit, the really difficult energy transition, and this widening gap between profits and jobs or investment. But the CEA seemed to single out something even deeper, didn't he? Something almost foundational to all these other issues, this trust deficit.
He really did. He argued that India's specific societal structure presents a unique challenge here. He noted something common in many cultures, actually. There's very high trust within immediate groups, within families, kinship networks, local communities.
Okay, high trust inside the circle.
Right. But the significant issue he flagged is the comparatively low level of trust outside those close-knit circles.
And where does that low outside trust cause the biggest problems, economically speaking?
He pointed specifically to the trust, or lack thereof, between broader society and the government, and also critically in impersonal transactions.
Impersonal transactions, meaning?
Meaning the kind of arm's-length dealings you have with people you don't personally know, buying from a company you've never met, dealing with the government agency, or relying on contracts, all the stuff that's really the bedrock of a large, modern, efficient economy.
So you trust your family, your neighbor, maybe your local community group implicitly. But extending that same level of trust to a company based miles away, or a national regulatory body, or even just a stranger in a business deal, that's harder.
That's the dynamic he described. And the consequences, he argued, are pretty severe. For one, it hampers the efficient provision of public goods,
Public could
like essential services, infrastructure that benefits everyone, but is hard for individuals or private firms to provide alone. Think clean air regulations, reliable national roads, an effective and impartial legal system. If trust is low, coordinating and delivering these things becomes much harder and less efficient.
Got it. So it's not just individuals distrusting each other, is that this lack of broad trust makes the whole collective system work less effectively.
Precisely. And he made a very, very pointed comment about regulation, specifically about regulatory overreach.
Which businesses often complain about, right? Too much red tape.
Exactly. But he suggested a significant share of this overreach, which often does stifle business, is actually a response to what he called the non-reciprocity of trust by the private sector.
Yeah, unpack that. Non-reciprocity of trust.
Essentially, if the government perceives that businesses don't trust its intentions or won't comply with regulations unless forced by very strict rules, then the government tends to respond by, well, imposing tighter, more complex, maybe even more intrusive rules. It can become a kind of vicious cycle fueled by mutual suspicion.
Which sounds like a perfect recipe for inefficiency, slowing everything down, higher costs.
It really does. And ultimately, in the CEA's view, this pervasive low trust outside those close groups fundamentally prevents India from achieving the kind of scale in markets, scale in institutions that's needed for sustained high-level economic growth. You just can't build truly large, efficient systems if that foundational layer of impersonal trust is weak.
And you can immediately see how this links back directly to the very first word in his proposed solution: trust.
Absolutely, it's foundational.
Okay, so let's pivot properly to that solution now. The CEA's path forward, his formula: trust, deregulate, and reciprocate. We've really dug into why building trust is so crucial based on his diagnosis. What about the other two parts, deregulate and reciprocate?
Right. He framed this whole thing as needing a kind of collaborative compact, a new understanding really between the government and the private sector industry.
Okay.
Deregulate is presented as a key tool, a lever the government can pull. It's about cutting unnecessary red tape, streamlining processes, making rules clearer and fairer, basically boosting efficiency and lowering the cost of doing business legitimately.
Making it easier and faster to operate within the rule.
Exactly. And then reciprocate. Well, that seems aimed squarely back at industry, doesn't it? Pushing back on that profit-job imbalance we talked about earlier.
It does feel like a direct challenge.
It is. This is where he directly challenged industry leaders. He used that word reciprocate quite deliberately, I think, to challenge them to close that widening gap between their soaring profitability and their relatively sluggish levels of capital investment. His question seems to be, are you taking these higher profits and genuinely reinvesting them back into the real economy, into building new capacity, expanding operations, and crucially, creating jobs?
And it wasn't just about any kind of investment, was it? He linked it back to that mismatched inheritance idea, leveraging India's core strength.
Yes, exactly. He specifically urged industry to actively pursue labor-intensive manufacturing and services alongside whatever capital-intensive growth they're doing. Given that need for, 8 million jobs a year?
Yeah, a huge number.
India simply cannot afford to rely solely on growth models that are capital-heavy but job-light. It needs both, but especially needs that job creation engine fired up.
And he made a strong argument, didn't he, that this isn't necessarily some zero-sum game, that focusing on labor isn't automatically bad for capital in the long run.
That's a really crucial part of his argument, I think. He stated very clearly there is no medium-term trade-off between the interests of capital and the interests of labor. His point is that widespread unemployment or underemployment, stagnant wages for the majority, that ultimately undermines the entire market for businesses themselves. You need people with money in their pockets to buy your goods and services. A prosperous, widely employed population is actually better for sustained business growth in the medium to long term than an economy where all the gains get concentrated at the very top.
That makes intuitive sense. Speaking of industry's role and the future of jobs, the CEA also had a specific warning, didn't he, about how companies think about and deploy new technology, particularly AI.
He did, yeah. It was quite pointed. He cautioned strongly against just adopting AI across the board simply because the technology is available or because competitors are doing it.
So it's not inevitable.
That was his key message. He emphasized that deploying AI is fundamentally a business decision choice. It's not some irresistible force that companies must surrender to. They have agency.
So companies have a responsibility here, in his view.
Absolutely. And his call was quite clear. Businesses need to actively choose where to deploy AI and where human labor is more appropriate for India's job needs.
Right, linking it directly back to that national imperative of creating millions of jobs.
Exactly. It's about making deliberate, conscious technology choices that align not just with narrow, firm-level productivity, perhaps, but also with India's broader development needs and its specific labor market reality.
Okay. And finally, just broadening the scope slightly before we wrap up, he offered one more crucial warning. This one aims specifically at Indian exporters.
Yes, this was interesting. He advised exporters basically not to bank on the rupee continuing to depreciate against other major currencies.
Which is often something that helps exporters, right? A weaker rupee makes Indian goods cheaper for buyers overseas.
It does. It can provide a competitive cushion, but he suggested they shouldn't assume that trend will just continue indefinitely.
And why might that trend change? Did he give reasons?
He hinted that various global economic shifts and trends might actually start pushing India towards needing or perhaps experiencing a stronger currency over time. He didn't elaborate hugely, but the implication was clear.
And if the rupee does strengthen, or even just stops weakening, what does that mean for Indian companies trying to compete globally?
It means that relying on a favorable exchange rate as your main competitive advantage becomes much less viable, maybe not viable at all. Competitiveness then has to come from within, from genuine domestic productivity gains, from being more efficient, more innovative, which of course ties right back into his broader strategy. It makes those efforts towards deregulation, building trust, fostering innovation. It makes them even more critical for Indian businesses to succeed on the world stage. You have to be genuinely good and efficient at home. You can't just rely on a cheap currency to bail you out.
Okay, right. So let's try and quickly pull together the main threads of this deep dive into the chief economic advisor's perspective. He sees India's big 2047 developed economy ambition, but he's flagging some really significant headwinds.
Yeah, serious headwinds. Those include that foundational challenge of, building on an inherited economic model, capital intensive, that's kind of mismatched for India's labor-abundant reality. Then there's navigating that really costly and complex energy transition tightrope.
Getting to develop status before net zero?
Exactly. And also tackling that unsustainable gap he highlighted, where corporate profits have been racing ahead of both reinvestment back into the economy and job creation or wages.
And sort of underlying or maybe weaving through all of it, acting as a major brake on progress, is this critical trust deficit.
Mm-hmm.
That low trust outside the immediate circles, particularly between society and government, and in those crucial impersonal transactions, he sees it hampering public services and fueling regulatory inefficiency.
Right. But he does offer a path forward, his proposed collaborative formula: trust, deregulate, and reciprocate. Yeah, government needs to focus on building trust and deregulating effectively. And industry, the private sector, is challenged to reciprocate by investing more of those profits, by actively prioritizing labor-intensive jobs alongside other growth, and by making really conscious choices about technology like AI, choices that align with India's huge need for jobs.
Really understanding these deep structural issues, these societal challenges that the CEA laid out, it provides such crucial context, doesn't it? For anyone trying to track India's growth story, trying to figure out what happens next. It's a reminder that the headline numbers, they're always influenced by these more fundamental realities on the ground.
Absolutely. It's much more complex than just looking at GDP figures. And, based on his really strong emphasis that bridging this trust deficit is absolutely foundational to tackling the economic hurdles.
Yeah, he kept coming back to trust.
He really did. And his call for this kind of government-industry collaboration, this reciprocity, it leads to a final thought, perhaps, to leave with you, the listener. If building trust across different segments of society is truly that essential for India's economic future, well, just how profoundly difficult is it for a country as large, as incredibly diverse as India, to fundamentally shift those deep-seated historical patterns of trust?
Shifting trust between citizens and the government, between businesses and regulators, even just between strangers engaging in commerce.
Exactly. How do you actually do that? What practical steps, beyond the kind of high-level compacts between government and industry leaders he suggests, could actually start to build that broader societal trust at scale? It really adds this complex, human, almost sociological layer onto the economic blueprint he sketched out, something to really mull over.